I continue to read the book Scottish Enlightenment, Chapter 6, A Select Society, Adam Smith and His Friends, Part 2. For Adam Smith, our moral life, as well as our cultural life, is a matter of imagination. The richer the inventory of objects for its diversion, and the deeper our own fellow feeling, the happier we become. But also the more we can perceive happiness in others. He said, our imagination, which in pain and sorrow seems to be confined and cooped up within our own persons, in times of ease and prosperity expands itself to everything around us. We are charmed then with the beauty of that accommodation which reigns in the palaces and the economy of the great, and admire how everything is adapted to promote their ease, to prevent their wants, to gratify their wishes. We naturally confound in our imagination with the order, the regular, and the harmonious movement of the system, the machine or economy by means of which it is produced. That's what he wrote. So already in the fourth book of the Theory of Moral Sentiments, we meet the crucial term economy, at first in its narrow meaning, referring to the households of the rich and the mighty, and how the pleasures of wealth and greatness strike the imagination as something grand and beautiful and noble, of which the attainment is well worth the toil and anxiety which we are so apt to bestow upon it. But Smith also employs it in the more modern sense as the machine or economy by which that wealth is produced. In other words, commercial society. And here, imagination turns out to be the driving wheel of that system as well. Our imagination, the inner picture of ourselves being as rich and comfortable as a Duke of Argyll or a Bill Gates, spurs on our efforts, focusing and directing our energies towards a single purpose. It is this deception, Smith adds, which rouses and keeps in continual motion the industry of mankind. It is this which first prompted them to cultivate the ground, to build houses, to found cities and commonwealths, and to invent and improve all the sciences and arts which ennoble and embellish human life, which have entirely changed the whole face of the globe, have turned the rude forests of nature into agreeable and fertile plains, and made the trackless and barren ocean a new fount of subsistence, and the great high road of communication to the different nations of the earth. The rich man is the man with the most fertile imagination. In other words, his eyes really are bigger than his stomach. By devoting all his efforts and those of his employees and tenants to his land or his warehouses or factory, he ends up producing far more than he can consume himself. The rich consume little more than the poor, and in spite of their natural selfishness and rapacity, though they mean only their own conveniency and their own vain and insatiable desires, they divide with the poor the produce of all their improvements. They are led by an invisible hand to make the same distribution of the necessities of life, which would have been made had the earth been divided into equal proportions among all its inhabitants. Thus, without intending it, without knowing it, the rich advance the interest of the society and afford means to the multiplication of the species. Okay, I want to stop here just to make one comment. It is indeed interesting to notice this extra access that someone can make beyond what he can consume. We often hear people say that why do we need so much money? Why do we need so much wealth? We cannot take it when we die with us. That seems so reasonable, at least it's a chicken soup kind of thing, to let us to relax. But this human society requires some people, if they have the capacity, to produce more than they can use for themselves. Otherwise, human will suffer inadequate material for the human kind to survive, to progress, because most of people cannot produce even more than he can consume, maybe much less than what he can consume. So in this sense, people have the capacity must work harder to make more so that all the population can have sufficient material to consume. I think that's what I get from reading this part. It's a great argument. Let's continue. The theory of moral sentiments made Smith famous. To his dying day, he thought of it as a better book than The Wealth of Nations. And in fact, as we can see, it contains all the seeds of that later work. It won the warm approval of Hume. The book also won great praise for its solidity and truth from Edmund Burke, the rising member of Parliament and author of the Theory of the Sublime, who wrote to Smith that a theory like yours, founded on the nature of a man, which is always the same, will last. German intellectuals read it with a fascination, particularly Immanuel Kant, who asked plaintively, where in Germany is the man who can write so well about the moral character? Voltaire summed up the feelings of many French philosophers when he exclaimed, we have nothing to compare with him, and I'm embarrassed for my dear compatriots. Admiration for the book did not necessarily extend to approval of every idea in it. Some reviewers wanted to know if Smith was saying that we have no higher standard of morality than the one society imposes on us. What if a society demands of us actions that are actually evil? Are we condemned to be social conformists forever? Smith replied no. He said, we soon learn to set up in our minds a judge between ourselves and those we live with, who weighs our actions according to an impartial standard, so that real magnanimity and conscious virtue can support itself under the disapprobation of all mankind. But the conformity problem would not go away, and it would haunt every Enlightenment figure who treated morality as essentially a matter of a social utility. Instead, it would take a renegade French musician, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and a former army chaplain from the Highlands, Adam Ferguson, to break that issue wide open and explore the new ethical horizons that it opened up. The result would be the birth of the Romantic movement, which proposed a different relationship between the inner self and society, one born of conflict rather than cooperation, in which our happiness seems possible only at the expense of others, and vice versa. All this seemed a long way off, though, particularly to Smith. His most important work still lay ahead. It was the indirect result of his friendship with the 18-year-old Duke of Buccleuch, one of Scotland's wealthiest aristocrats. The English politician and future Chancellor of the Exchequer, Charles Toussaint, had suggested that Buccleuch take Smith as his tutor for his grand tour of Europe. Smith and Hume had given Toussaint a copy of the theory of moral sentiments. The grand tour was the rite of passage of wealthy adolescent Britons in the 18th century. It involved visiting Western Europe cities such as Paris, Amsterdam, Venice, and Rome to taste the artistic, social, and often sexual fruits of the culture of the continent. It often could last a year or more. Smith, worn out by his teaching and administrative chores at Glasgow, he had become dean of the faculty in 1760, happily accepted the invitation and set out with his young pupil for the continent in February 1766. The reader who expects the trip to have been a fiasco, with the young Buccleuch turning out to be a holy terror, a kind of aristocratic Tom Jones, is going to be disappointed. In fact, Buccleuch seems to have been a sweet, rather shy boy, not overburdened with intellect, but serious enough for Smith to give him Hume's History of England to read on the way. A strong bond of affection and trust developed between them, strong enough that when they returned, Buccleuch offered Smith enough money to quit teaching and to write his next big book, a sort of 18th century genius grant. The book Smith completed in 1775 was, of course, his inquiry into the nature and the causes of the wealth of nations, which appeared in print the following spring. It was the logic follow-up to Smith's earlier lectures on civil and natural law, but also to the themes of his moral theory. How and why do human beings learn to cooperate, and what makes for a constructive, useful life as opposed to a destructive one? Its strictly economic chapters, especially in books 1 and 2, touched on subjects that certain French thinkers, the so-called physiocrats, had taken up in their writing. Smith knew their work and met several of them during his stay in Paris with Buccleuch. However, he does not seem to have taken much of what they said to heart, and he came back from his Paris visit very unimpressed. The real inspiration for his subject was his fellow Scots and the work they had done over the past 3 decades on the history of civil society, of how commerce and manufactures gradually introduced order and good government, and with them the liberty and security of individuals. Lurking in the background of the wealth of nations are Keynes, Hume, Robertson, and even Hutchinson. It is not only Adam Smith's masterpiece, it is also the summa of the Scottish Enlightenment, a summation of its exploration of the nature of human progress, and its salute to the triumph of the modern. Starting with Chapter 1, Smith explains how the business of civilization gets done. by isolating the basic principle that explains all social improvement, the division of labor. This is Smith's term. The idea itself probably originated with David Hume, who called it the partition of employments. We use another, perhaps better, word for it, specialization. The notion itself is simple. When we concentrate our energy on one task rather than several, we increase our productivity. Instead of herding and fishing and farming for our living, as primitive men of the Highland clansmen did, we just farm. The result is we grow more than enough to feed ourselves. Enough, in fact, to sell to others. Later, instead of dividing our time between growing and then bartering or selling our produce, we decide to leave the farming to someone else and concentrate on just buying and selling. We become merchants and soon discover we can earn far more than the farmers and the peasants who sell us the fruit of their labors. And so on. At each stage of a civil society's progress, the division of labor, Smith believed, was the inevitable rule everywhere. It occurred at every stage and in every human society. But its role becomes particularly pronounced in commercial society as we continue to specialize and become increasingly more productive. The fruits of our labors are no longer things we consume ourselves. They become commodities, literally the things that make our lives comfortable, which we buy and sell in exchange for other goods. We start to think about our labor in a new way. We look for ways to improve what we make and save time in making it, in order to sell it at market to get the things we really want. Capitalism is born, the system of economic production behind commercial society, a system whose productivity and inventiveness put all the rest in the shade. The reason is that capitalism brings intellectual as well as economic change. It alters the way we think about ourselves and about others. We become buyers and sellers, customers and suppliers, who strive to improve the quality and the quantity of our output in order to gratify our needs. Eventually, Smith states, the division of labor produces a people who do nothing but think about improvements. Engineers, such as his friends James Watt and Alexander Wilson. Scientists, such as Joseph Black, and those whose trade it is not to do anything, but to observe everything. Philosophers, teachers, and professional managers of every sort. The division of labor, in short, applies not just to physical labor, such as growing carrots or selling tobacco or making nails, but to intellectual labor as well. Each individual becomes more expert in his own particular branch. Smith explains, more work is done upon the whole, and the quantity of science is considerably increased by it. It lays the necessary foundation for technological innovation, as well as the gift of cultural refinement. Society finds space for its white-collar professionals, people who have time to do nothing but write, paint, teaching, compose music, count numbers, or plead cases in court, all for the gratification of the rest of our fellow citizens. Smith had finally defined the link between commerce and cultural progress, which the rest of the Scottish Enlightenment had written about and celebrated, but not really improved. but he also opened up a broader point and gestured towards another, often overlooking advantage to living in a modern commercial society. As the fourth stage of human progress, it produces more in greater quantities than any of its predecessors. It is also productive in fact that it can supply the wants and needs not only of those who work, but of those who do not. In the early drafts of Wealth of Nations, Smith strongly emphasized this. Unfortunately, most of it did not make it to the final published version. He considered that capitalism generates a great inequality of wealth, with a very few commanding the great bulk of commodities and a great part of the rest sharing what is left. But even so, Smith wanted to know in what manner shall we account for the superior affluence and abundance commonly possessed by even the lowest and the most despised member of a civilized society, compared with what the most respected and active savage can attain to. The answer is again division of labor, in which so great a quantity of everything is produced, that there is enough both to gratify the slothful and oppressive profusion of the great, and at the same time abundantly to supply the wants of the artisan and the peasant. Better to be a poor man in a rich country than a rich man in a poor one. It was a lesson in comparative advantage that Smith and his generation saw played out in the Scottish Highlands. Later on, the modern West learned it again as it watched the floods of third world immigrants gladly give up their homes in Bangladesh or Guatemala for the most manual jobs they could find in London or New York. On this point, and as on so many in the Wealth of Nations, Smith shared his friend Hume's delight in irony. Commentators sometimes suggest that irony is the most characteristic attitude of the modern mind. Certainly, the enlightened Scots had it in abundance. It sprung from their pursuit of intellectual detachment in observing human affairs, in noticing how our intention and expectations so often differ from our actual performance. In Smith's case, that detachment allowed him to see that the charity cases of commercial societies' universal opulence included not only the indigent and homeless at the bottom of the social scale, but the rich and famous at the top. It also led him to perceive the real significance of self-interest as a human motivation. Division of labor is one universal condition for the making of a civil society. The other, even more essential and universal, is self-interest. Smith described it in Hume's terms as a passion or emotional impulse rather than a cold, rational calculation, or what other philosophers like to call self-interest rightly understood. Self-interest acts like an emotional spur. It is an inner compulsion to better ourselves and our circumstances, which forces us to take action even when we do not particularly want to. It is in fact the drive behind the division of labor. Contrary to popular misunderstanding, Adam Smith never supposed that everyone is driven solely by self-interest in a material sense. He knew that many of us, perhaps most, are not. Certainly, very few people are so driven that they make great sacrifices and efforts in order to gratify its demands, but enough do to make a difference. They force the pace of progress forward, prodded along by their imagining of wealth and fortune, just as the theory for moral sentiments foresaw. The surplus they produce in a world governed by scarcity spills over to the rest of us. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner. Smith wrote in one of the most famous passages of the wealth of nations, but from their regard to their own interest. Of course, Smith was not the first to propose this paradox, that self-interest, even great, is actually beneficial to society and to the human species. The Dutch moralist Bernard Mandeville had said the same thing almost a century earlier, arguing that what most moralists condemned as vices were actually virtues. In their beneficial effect on the economy. Luxury employed millions of the poor, and the odious pride a million more. Envy itself and vanity were ministers of industry. Their darling folly, fickleness in diet, furniture, and dress, that strange ridiculous wise was made the very wheel that turned the trade. Smith carried Mandeville one step further, however, revealing an even deeper paradox and a greater irony. The pursuit of our own self-interest actually causes us to reach out to others. This is true of all societies, as Hume and Keynes had realized. The Bushman soon realized that the hunt goes easier when he has help, instead of having to do it all by himself. But Smith's bold insight was to realize that it was the genius of capitalism to carry both of these characteristics, the pursuit of self-interest and the need for cooperation to their highest pitch. On the one hand, it multiplies the opportunities and lessens the amount of direct physical labor necessary to pursue that interest. On the other, the relentless search for customers to buy and to suppliers to sell results in a vast network of interdependence, binding people together in far more complex ways than is possible in more primitive conditions. In civilized society, a person stands at all times in need of a cooperation and assistance of great multitudes, Smith wrote, while his whole life is scarce sufficient to gain the friendship of a few persons. Then still another paradox and a further irony. The interdependence of the market begets interdependence of the mind, meaning the freedom to see one's own self-interest and the opportunity to pursue it. We recall that for Hutchinson, human happiness had been about personal liberty, the capacity to live one's life as one saw fit without harming others. For Keynes, it had been about owning property, which gives us our sense of propriety and identity as human beings. Now Smith put the two together by entering and competing in a great interactive dynamic network of modern society. At once impersonal but also indispensable to happiness, we become fully free and human. Independence in this sense becomes the hallmark of a modern society, just as dependence on others or servility becomes the hallmark of primitive societies and institutions. Nobody but a beggar, Smith admonished, chooses to depend chiefly upon the benevolence of his fellow citizens. Yet this has been the essential fate of the vast majority of humankind through most of history, as slaves toiling for their masters, as peasants handing over the harvest to their feudal lords, or as members of the tribe or clan dependent on their chieftain's command for life or death. Hapless creatures whose quality of life rests entirely on whether their chief is a gentle local or a brute like a Con MacDonald. Capitalism breaks that cycle and offers the conditions under which we forge our own happiness, independence, material affluence, and cooperation with others. Today, more than 200 years later, three great myths still surround Adam Smith and his Wealth of Nations. The first is that Smith believed that the wealth of capitalism was generated by some great, guiding, invisible hand. In fact, the term which appears in Wealth of Nations and the theory for moral sentiments is meant to be taken once again as irony. Smith did believe that capitalism produces its own kind of a natural rational order, based on the market and its complex, interlocking system of a self-interested exchange. To a superficial observer, it might appear as if everyone were moving according to a single directing mind or invisible hand. But his real point was not that the market-based order was perfect or even perfectible. Rather, it was more beneficial and ultimately more rational than ones put together by politicians or rulers, who are themselves creatures of their own passions and whims. Here, Smith's chief target was what he termed, and what has been known ever since as the mercantile system. He found it exemplified in theory in a book by another Scot, Sir James Stewart, titled Inquiry into the Principle of Political Economy. Actually, it's a political economy. And in practice, in the British government's handling of its overseas empire. Stewart's inquiry appeared in 1767, and although Smith pronounced the book an ingenious performance, everything about it infuriated him. Stewart was a strong believer in state intervention to develop trade and expand economic growth. He even argued that without the government's constant attention, its foreign trade might actually grind to a halt, leaving the nation vulnerable and destitute. This was the sort of justification for punitive tariffs, export subsidies, and government-granted trade monopolies that Smith saw at work in Britain's overseas empire, and which he was determined to fight. He wrote of Stewart's work, I flatter myself that every false principle in it will meet with a clear and distant confutation in mind. In fact, Books 3 and 4 of the Wealth of Nations are a devastating analysis of the attempts by successive governments to manipulate the powerful productive forces of overseas trade, foolishly believing they could increase wealth by government dictate, when in fact they usually did the opposite. The centerpiece is Smith's scathing critique of London's policy towards the American colonies, which, by the time he was writing in 1775, had reached a critical point. Smith followed the American crisis not only from recent news reports and parliamentary debates, but also from his tobacco merchant friends such as Glassford and Ingram, who had lived in Virginia and Maryland and knew the situation firsthand. They understood, as Smith did, that Scotland was perfectly poised to benefit from a policy of free trade with America, and that London's short-sighted efforts to bend the Americans to its will would not only cripple their own business there, which it did, but would cost Britain her empire as well. There are no colonies of which the progress has been more rapid than that of the English in North America, Smith wrote, and yet, thanks to its monopolistic policies, Great Britain derives nothing but loss from the dominion which she assumes over her colonies. Smith's critique reached out beyond colonial monopolies to all kinds of unwanted government meddling in economic affairs. This is the second myth about wealth of nations. That in it, Smith invented the notion of a laissez-faire capitalism, in which the government has little or no role to play. In fact, the phrase laissez-faire comes from French economists, not Smith, who does not use the term at all. And contrary to the myth, Smith did see an important role for a strong national government. He saw it as necessary for providing a system of national defense to protect its society and its commerce with its neighbors. It also must provide a system of justice and protection of individual rights, particularly the right to property. It is only under the shelter of the civil magistrate that the owner of that valuable property, which is acquired by the labor of many years, or perhaps many successive generations, can sleep a single night in security. And it is needed to help defray the expenses of essential public works, such as roads, bridges, canals, and harbors. Beyond that, however, Smith saw any other form of government interference as having all kinds of unintended consequences. History offered innumerable examples of governments and rulers, often with the best intentions, trying to change or adjust their nation's economic life, with disastrous results. Roman emperors had attempted to regulate the sagging economy of the late empire and had destroyed it instead. Spain had tried to maintain a monopoly on the flow of bullion from the New World, only to bankrupt itself. Smith worried that Britain and its policy in America was headed down the same road. To Adam Smith, belief in a free market was not an intellectual dogma, but a basic lesson of history. It was time for rulers to learn from their mistakes and let commercial society follow its own course. He wrote, all systems either of preference or of restraint, therefore, being thus completely taken away, the obvious and simple system of a natural liberty establishes itself of its own accord. Every man, as long as he does not violate the laws of justice, is left perfectly free to pursue his own interest his own way. The sovereign is completely discharged from a duty, in the attempting to perform which he must always be exposed to innumerable delusions, and for the proper performance of which no human wisdom or knowledge could ever be sufficient. The duty of superintending the industry of private people and of directing it towards the employments most suitable to the interest of society. This is the Adam Smith with whom we are all familiar, the great prophet of free market capitalism as a system of natural liberty, and the great enemy of any and all attempts to tinker with that system, whether for the sake of a political power or social justice. But there is another, less obvious Adam Smith who also appears in the pages of Wealth of Nations. He too was a player in the contemporary debate raging in Edinburgh about the new commercial spirit sweeping across Scotland and what it might mean for the future. This Adam Smith also flies in the face of the third myth about him and his greatest work, that is basically an apologia for big business and the merchant class. In fact, while Wealth of Nations speaks highly of free markets, it treats businessmen themselves in a very different light. To begin with, Smith saw the important beneficiaries of the free market not as businessmen, but as consumers. Consumption is the sole end and the purpose of all production, and the interest of the producer ought to be attended to, only so far as it may be necessary for promoting that of the consumer. This was precisely what the existing British system failed to do. It put the interest of the producer and the merchants ahead of that of consumers, who only want low prices and a ready supply of goods. Merchants often prefer the opposite. In fact, Smith understood that much of the British government's disastrous trade policies came at the instigation of the London merchants themselves, who wanted to protect their livelihood. It is the interest of every man to live as much at his ease as he can, Smith notes in Book 5, and that rule applies as much to the businessman as it does to the landlord, to the landed aristocrat or university professor. His overall picture of the typical businessman is certainly unflattering, and reading it must have made some of his tobacco-lord friends slightly uncomfortable. He notes that while they often complained about high prices, they saw nothing concerning the bad effects of high profits. He speaks of their mean rapacity and monopolizing spirit, and suggests that the government of an exclusive company of a merchant is perhaps the worst of all government for any country whatsoever. Most of this was aimed at the business community in London, which had instigated and benefited from the corrupt old imperial system. Rather than Glasgow, Smith's point was that the free market was as much a check upon the greed and power of the merchant as it was on an interfering king or government bureaucrat. But Smith saw another, more systematic corruption flowing from commercial society, one that was more pernicious and worried him deeply, even as capitalism increases specialization and more sophistication in the overall output of goods and services. The individuals caught up in the process become narrower in their interest and less concerned with what happens outside their shop, office, or showroom. They come to weigh everything in terms of their job, of profit and loss, and lose sight of the larger picture. This worry appeared years before in one Smith's lectures and is worth quoting in full. Another bad effect of commerce is that it sinks the courage of mankind and tends to extinguish martial spirit. In all commercial countries, the division of labor is infinite, and everyone's thoughts are employed about one particular thing. The minds of men are contracted and rendered incapable of elevation, education is despised, or at least neglected, and the heroic spirit is utterly extinguished. Preventing this kind of a mental mutilation, Smith says in The Wealth of Nations, deserves the most serious attention of a government. It is in fact the one place where Smith actually commands a genuinely active role for civic institutions, creating a system of education that will counteract this deformity of the human character by the division of labor. Through capitalism we gain, but we also lose. The loss Smith felt was felt most among the lowest classes. His particular examples was employees in a pin factory, whose cramped place in the chain of production leaves no room for the enlargement of the mind and spirit, which the freedom of a commercial society should open up. Smith in fact defined the problem of the assembly line mentality of factory workers almost 2 decades before the Industrial Revolution got fully underway. The problem that Karl Marx and his followers would call alienation. It was especially worrisome to Smith because in free countries where the safety of a government depends very much upon the favorable judgment which the people may form of its conduct, a mass of ignorant, culturally degraded citizens easily becomes an immense drag on the system. They become easy prey to demagogues and applaud every attempt to undermine the foundation of that natural liberty which they have enjoyed in the first place. So Smith had given one side of issues its final, definitive shape, the link between commercial society, refinement, and liberty. He had opened up a whole new territory for discussion and debate, the cultural costs of capitalism. In fact, he and his Edinburgh friends had been arguing about this for almost a decade, even before Dr. Johnson had wondered during his Scottish tour whether any society benefited from becoming entirely commercial in its mentality and attitudes. The Scots, including Adam Smith himself, had firmly answered no. The person who put the matter in the strongest terms was another member of the Select Society and founder of the Poker Club, Adam Ferguson. Born in Berkshire, along the border between the Highlands and the Lowlands, he had gone to Edinburgh to study for the ministry. There he became friends with the other future moderate literati, but he missed the traumatic events of 1745 and 46 when he accepted a post as a chaplain to the Black Watch Regiment in Flanders. It was an experience that profoundly altered Ferguson's perspective from that of his contemporaries. They, as we saw, considered Prince Charles' Highland followers uncouth barbarians and looked forward with undisguised relish to the demise of their society and culture. As chaplain, Ferguson had come to know the Highlanders firsthand and understood that for all their crude habits and harsh aggressiveness, they were men of honor with an undeniable sense of courage, loyalty, and generosity towards friend and foe alike. In fact, they reminded Ferguson of no one so much as the warriors of the Homeric poems and the ancient Spartans and Rome legends. The very qualities that his moderate friends admired in their beloved Greeks and Romans, Ferguson found alive and well in the Scottish Highlands. the destruction of the way of life meant the destruction of something precious. Ferguson decided, and Scotland and the Scots would be the poorer for it. Ferguson explained his arguments far beyond Scotland and into the very nature and history of civil society itself. In fact, that became the title of his book, Essay on the History of Civil Society, published in 1768. In it, Ferguson helped himself to generous proportions of Camps and Hume, as well as Adam Smith and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and another largely forgotten figure, Andrew Fletcher. The result was a volatile mixture of typical cold-eyed Scottish political and social analysis and fights of almost romantic poetry in praise of primitive people everywhere, but particularly in the Asian world and among Native Americans. Ferguson found in them what he had found in his Highland regiment: honor, integrity, and courage, which commercial society, as with its over-specialization and mental mutilation, destroyed. This was one of Ferguson's most striking points. Far from being civilized and advanced in their attitudes, the ancient Greeks and Romans were in fact, by modern standards, true primitives. A world of differences separated them from us, a world created and defined by the rise of capitalism. As Ferguson showed, modern civilization had erected an enormous barrier, cutting off polite nations not only from their barbarous neighbors, but from their own past as well. He quotes with approval a Native American chief telling a British official in Canada, "I'm a warrior, not a merchant." It is a sentiment that would have been shared by Achilles or a Hector, or even a Cato or a Pericles. Not to mention a Highland chieftain such as Lochiel. Their ardent attachment to their country, Ferguson wrote of the Asians, their contempt of suffering and of death in its cause. They are manly apprehensions of personal and independence, which rendered every individual, even under tottering establishments and imperfect laws, the guardian of freedom to his fellow citizens, have gained them the first rank among nations. All these qualities were being steadily eaten away in the new self-centered modern society taking shape around them. Today, the individual considers his community only so far as it can be rendered subservient to his personal advancement and profit. Human beings become weak and soft and lose their sense of honor and courage. They must have their creature comforts, no matter what. Freedom itself becomes a commodity to be sold to the highest bidder or seized by the strongest power. Ferguson saw history moving along the same line as his fellow Edinburgh literati, but the ultimate destination would be very different from what the prophets of progress had forecast. He wrote, "The boasted refinements, then, of the polished age are not divested of danger. They open a door, perhaps to disaster, as wide and accessible as any they have shut. If they build walls and ramparts, they enervate the minds of those who are placed to defend them. If they form disciplined armies, they reduce the military spirit of entire nations, and by placing the sword where they have given a distaste to society, to civil establishments, they prepare for mankind the government of force. The last stage of a modern history would be not liberty but tyranny. Unless something was done to prevent it, left to itself, commercial society would become humanity's tomb. Ferguson's book had an enormous impact when it came out. It contained one of the first uses of the word civilization in English, and coined the term civil society as synonymous with modernity itself. It made Ferguson almost as famous as Adam Smith, and on the continent almost as influential. The German Enlightenment particularly admired it, including the father of modern nationalism, John Gottfried Herder, and the founder of German Romanticism, the poet Friedrich Schiller. But Ferguson's closest reader would be Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, who incorporated many of Ferguson's ideas and even phrases into his own philosophy of history, which Karl Marx would take up and develop. In fact, Marxism owes its great debt to Ferguson, not Rousseau, as the most trenchant critic of capitalism and as the great alternative to Adam Smith as the prophet of modernity. Admiration among his fellow Scots was more measured. Hume disliked the essay. He saw it as a surrender to a kind of a romantic primitivism, which the controversy over the Ossian poems had recently set off. Adam Smith was miffed up by the fact that Ferguson had stolen many of his insights from Smith's own lectures, including the part about the decline of martial spirits in capitalist society. The real disagreement was not over content, however, but the tone. Smith and Hume clearly saw the shortcomings of a society organized completely around the gratification of self-interest and the calculation of profit and loss. They saw the virtues of pre-modern ruled societies disappearing, along with their vices, and understood that they pay a heavy price for the division of labor and specialization in a modern complex economy. But they believe firmly that the benefits were worth the price. A society that could finally feed everyone, not just a chosen few, that could relieve the poverty and the misery of even the weakest and the least productive of its members, that recognized the sovereignty of the individual and his rights, and agreed to leave him alone to pursue his own ends. That put a premium on treating others with kindness and deference rather than disdain and exploitation. And finally, that recognized that it was better to do business with other nations than to try to conquer them, was not one on the verge of tyranny, but just the opposite. These were the conditions of modern liberty. If the Asians had contrasted a version of freedom that lacked these essential ingredients, then they, not we, were the poorer for it. And if a commercial society offered new problems, it also offered solutions. Steps could be taken to correct costs and counteract the bad effects of commerce. Smith and Ferguson had defined even the cultural ones. On such solutions was education, and Smith, in the late sections of Wealth Nations, strongly urged the public support for a system of schools that could make sure the benefit of a civilized culture reached as large a public as possible. Not surprisingly, his model was Scotland's own system of parish schools, which has taught almost the whole common people to read and a very great proportion of them to write and count. Smith knew that a modern capitalist society without a decent system of education was committing suicide, politically as well as culturally. Another solution was one that many of Smith's Edinburgh friends had embraced, including Adam Ferguson: the creation of a citizen militia. This was a sore subject for Scotsmen. Ever since the 45, they had been denied the use and ownership of weapons, and the Parliament's passage of a Militia Act in 1757, and then, during the American War, deliberately left the Scots out. Ferguson had become a virtual firebrand on the issue. He organized the poker club, especially to stir up public support for creating a Scottish militia. He also wrote pamphlets on the subject, as did John Home and other moderates, arguing that a citizen militia was a way to keep alive the traditions of a physical courage and martial spirit in a commercial society. Why did the Scottish Enlightenment embrace the militia cause so strongly? Lurking in the background, perhaps were uncomfortable memories of the volunteer companies of 1745 and that ill-fated march through Edinburgh. When liberty is threatened, can anyone expect a young man raised in a quasi-commercial environment to risk their lives on the battlefield against tough and hardened warriors? Obviously not, unless they have help. Not material help in this case, but cultural help, something that taught them self-sacrifice, discipline, and loyalty, and gave them confidence in their own physical powers and those of their weapons. This Ferguson and the rest believed militia training could do, and Adam Smith came to agree with them, although he warned in Wealth of Nations that a citizen militia could never equal the discipline of a professional army in peacetime. He did believe a few campaigns in the field could harden them into an effective fighting force, the record of citizen soldiers in modern times, from Saratoga and Gettysburg to El Alamein and Omaha Beach, tends to bear him out. The agitation for a Scottish militia failed to move legislators in London, but it did set a new standard for later debates about the future of free societies and the place of military virtues and military arms in them. The idea that a free people needed to keep and bear arms in order to defend their liberty was an ancient one, reaching back to the Greeks and forward to Andrew Fletcher. But now Ferguson and his friends had added something new, a social psychological dimension. By owning weapons and learning to use them, a commercial people can keep alive a collective sense of honor, valor, and physical courage, traditions that no society, no matter how sophisticated and advanced, can afford to do without. Here again, we see how the force of the debate had shifted. The issue was no longer how to make Scotland civilized and modern. They had been done. The question now was, having crossed that irrevocable line, what could be preserved of what came before? A watershed had been passed, and everyone knew it. The Wealth of Nations was published on March 6, 1776. In February of that year, another masterpiece had appeared, the first volume of Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Although English, Gibbon modeled his work closely on the Scottish and Edinburgh historical school. For all intents and purposes, he was intellectually a Scot. One of his closest friends was Adam Ferguson, but his other heroes were Hume and Smith, whose new book Gibson called the most profound and systematic treatise on the great objects of trade and revenue which had ever been published in any age or century. When Hume wrote to Gibbon praising his new history, Gibbon said that the letter repaid the labor of 10 years. On August 25, 1776, David Hume died after a long illness. His funeral drew a huge crowd, as his body was carried in pouring rain from his house in the new town to the old cotton burying ground. Although Hume dismissed the idea of an afterlife to the very end, his last hours were calm and serene. Joseph Black described them in a letter to Adam Smith. When he spoke to the people about him, he always did it with affection and tenderness. Earlier, on July 4th, a different world-shattering event took place across the Atlantic. The American Revolution lurks in the background of every chapter of Wealth of Nations, just as it occupied the attention of so many of Smith's colleagues and friends. Yet in certain ways, the reverse was also true. Scottish ideas and Scots were having a large impact on the events unfolding in the American colonies.